Until you truly learn these hard life lessons, changing your life is almost impossible. And I wish someone had forced me to understand that before I turned 80 and realized most of my life had already been spent. I was sitting on my wooden porch in Ohio, the late afternoon sun stretching across the cornfields, my long white beard resting against my chest, when my grandson Ethan looked at me and asked, "Grandpa, why do you always say you're going to change, but nothing ever really changes?" And I laughed at first, the way old men do when we want to dismiss something uncomfortable, but his question didn't leave. It followed me inside, lingered in the kitchen while I poured my black coffee, and sat across from me at the oak table my late wife and I bought 40 years ago for $299 at a furniture store that doesn't even exist anymore. I had spent decades believing that change required something dramatic, a new house, a better job, a fresh start in another state, maybe Florida where winters don't bite at your bones. But at 80 years old, I was still in the same town, still carrying the same grudges, still telling the same stories about how life had been unfair to me. And the truth I didn't want to face was simple. I had never actually learned the lessons life kept trying to teach me. When my wife told me 20 years ago that I didn't listen, I said she was too sensitive. When my son stopped calling as often, I blamed his busy career in Chicago. When friends drifted away, I told myself people these days just don't value loyalty. And every time something went wrong, I adjusted the scenery, but never the script, convinced that if I just waited long enough, circumstances would shift and I would finally feel different. What Ethan's question forced me to see was that I had been waiting for a miracle without doing the work, hoping wisdom would arrive automatically with gray hair and wrinkles, assuming age itself meant growth. But age, without reflection, is just time passing, nothing more. I remember being 45 and telling myself I would be more patient when I retired. I remember being 65 and promising I would soften once the mortgage was paid off. I remember being 75 and thinking it was too late to change anyway. And all those years slipped through my fingers like sand because I misunderstood something critical. Life does not reward intentions, it responds to habits. The habits I had built were quiet but powerful, interrupting people mid-sentence, defending myself before listening, holding on to pride like it was oxygen. And those habits shaped my relationships more than any external hardship ever did. Sitting there that evening, the sky turning orange over miles of farmland, I realized that changing your life is not about moving to a new zip code or buying a different truck or making a bold announcement at the dinner table. It begins in the uncomfortable space where you admit you might be the common denominator in your own disappointments. That realization was not dramatic. There were no tears, no shouting, just a quiet weight settling in my chest as I stared at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. An 80-year-old man with a long white beard who had mistaken stubbornness for strength. I thought about how many times I had said, "That's just the way I am," as if personality were a prison sentence instead of a pattern, and I began to see that every major regret in my life had been preceded by a small lesson I ignored, a conversation I brushed off, a warning I refused to hear. The hard truth is that life whispers before it shouts, and if you keep ignoring the whispers, you end up decades later wondering why nothing truly changed. That night I didn't make a grand declaration. I didn't vow to reinvent myself overnight. But for the first time in my life, I understood that until you genuinely learn the lessons repeated in your failures, in your strained relationships, in your quiet moments of loneliness, change will always feel out of reach. And the most dangerous illusion of all is believing you still have plenty of time to figure it out. I did not sleep much that night after Ethan asked me that question, and it was not because of noise or discomfort. It was because memory has a way of lining up quietly when you finally allow it to speak. And as I lay there in my small bedroom at the end of the hallway, the ceiling fan turning slowly above me, I began to replay the moments in my life when change had been offered to me in simple, ordinary forms, and I had refused it without even realizing it. I remembered a Sunday afternoon almost 30 years ago when my wife, Margaret, stood in this same kitchen and told me she felt alone even when I was sitting right across from her. And instead of asking her what she meant, I told her she was being dramatic. I told her I worked 60 hours a week to provide a roof over our heads and food on the table, as if a mortgage payment was the same thing as emotional presence. And I see now that was the first lesson I ignored, the lesson that providing is not the same as connecting. Later, when my son Daniel was in high school and asked me to come watch him run the 800-meter race. I promised I would try, but when a client called that Saturday morning, I chose the office instead of the track field, convincing myself there would be other races, other chances, and there were. But I missed most of them, and slowly he stopped asking, and I told myself he was becoming independent, when in truth he was learning not to rely on me. Each of those moments was small, almost invisible at the time. No raised voices, no dramatic exits, just subtle shifts, like a door closing softly instead of slamming, and I misunderstood the silence for stability. I always believed real problems announced themselves loudly, that warnings would arrive in bold letters. But the reality is that life hands you quiet corrections first, and if you do not adjust, the distance between you and the people you love grows inch by inch until one day it feels like miles. At 80 years old, I can measure that distance clearly. It is the space between phone calls, the polite tone in my son's voice when he visits twice a year, the way my grandson studies me carefully, as if trying to understand a man who is both familiar and distant at the same time. I used to think the world had changed too fast, that younger generations were too sensitive, too distracted, too different. But lying there in the dark, I finally admitted something harder. It was not the world that resisted me. It was me resisting growth, clinging to the idea that admitting fault meant losing authority. That softening meant weakness, and that time alone would smooth out the rough edges of my personality. What I understand now is that time does not transform you. It only reveals who you have been becoming all along, and without intentional effort, that version of you simply grows older, not wiser, and that realization settled into me with a calm certainty that felt heavier than regret, because it meant the responsibility had always been mine. The next morning I woke up before sunrise, the way I have for most of my life, out of habit more than necessity, and I walked slowly to the kitchen, listening to the old floorboards beneath my feet, aware that even the house seemed to carry the history of who I had been. And as I poured a glass of water and looked out at the fields still covered in a thin layer of mist, I understood that recognizing the problem was only the first step, because awareness without action is just another comfortable excuse. For years I believed that responsibility meant paying bills on time, keeping the lawn trimmed, making sure there was always food in the refrigerator, and in those areas I did well. But emotional responsibility was different. It required humility, and humility was something I had avoided as if it were a threat to my identity. I thought being the head of the household meant having the final word, not the open ear, and that belief shaped countless conversations where I spoke more than I listened, corrected more than I understood, and defended more than I reflected. As I stood there watching the sun slowly rise over acres of farmland, I began to see a pattern that had followed me from my 30s into my 80s. Whenever conflict appeared, my first instinct was to protect my pride, not the relationship, and pride is quiet but costly. It feels strong in the moment, but it leaves you standing alone later. I remembered the last real conversation I had with Daniel, about 5 years ago, when he tried to explain that he felt I judged his parenting choices, and instead of asking him to tell me more, I interrupted and said that experience mattered more than modern opinions, and I can still see the way his shoulders lowered slightly, not in anger, but in resignation, as if he realized that speaking openly with me would always feel like stepping into a debate he could not win. That was not the moment our distance began. It was simply one more brick added to a wall I had been building for decades. The difficult lesson forming in my mind that morning was this: you cannot demand closeness while consistently choosing superiority. You cannot expect warmth while offering correction instead of curiosity. And you cannot hope for change while protecting the very habits that prevent it. I had spent years believing that if others adjusted their tone, their timing, their approach, then everything would improve. But real growth begins when you examine your own tone, your own timing, your own approach. Standing alone in that quiet kitchen, I realized that at 80 years old I still had a choice, not to rewrite the past, but to respond differently today. And that choice began with something simple and uncomfortable: admitting without qualification that I had been wrong more often than I allowed myself to see, and understanding that responsibility is not a burden placed on you by others. It is a decision you make when you finally decide that protecting your ego is no longer worth the cost. That afternoon I did something that felt far more difficult than any physical labor I had done in my younger years. I sat down at the small desk in my living room where I used to sort bills and write checks, and I stared at my phone for nearly 10 minutes before picking it up, because deciding to change internally is quiet, but acting on it requires courage that pride resists. I scrolled to Daniel's name and realized how long it had been since I called him without a specific reason. No holiday, no birthday, no practical question about taxes or travel plans, just a simple call to talk. And it struck me that most of our conversations over the last decade had been transactional, efficient, polite, but not truly open. I used to tell myself that grown men do not need frequent conversations with their fathers, that independence means distance. But standing there in my quiet house, I could finally see that this belief had protected me from vulnerability more than it honored his independence. The hardest lesson forming inside me was not about money or career or reputation. It was about ego, about the subtle need to be right, to maintain the image of the strong patriarch who always had answers, and I began to understand that strength without humility turns into isolation. I thought about how many times I corrected Daniel in front of others, offering advice he did not ask for, believing I was guiding him, when in reality I was signaling that I did not fully trust his judgment, and trust is something you cannot demand. It is something you demonstrate by stepping back. I walked to the hallway mirror and looked at myself for a long moment, at the deep lines across my forehead, at the white beard that had grown thicker over the years, at the eyes that had seen 8 decades of change, and I asked myself a question I had avoided for most of my life. What if being respected is not about being unquestioned, but about being accountable? That question unsettled me because it meant that many of my strained relationships were not accidents. They were outcomes, predictable results of repeated behavior. I remembered telling Margaret once that I did not understand why people could not just accept me as I was, and now I see how unfair that was. Because growth is not about rejecting who you are, it is about refining who you are becoming. The realization did not make me collapse into regret. It made me quiet, focused, almost steady, because for the first time I was not looking outward for the next change. I was looking inward for the next adjustment. The lesson was simple but demanding. If I wanted different results in the years I have left, I would have to respond differently in the moments that matter, even if it felt uncomfortable, even if it meant admitting fault without adding explanation, and standing there in that familiar house in rural Ohio. I knew that the only way forward was to lower my pride before time lowered it for me. My thumb hovered over Daniel's name for a long moment before I finally pressed the call button. And as the phone rang, I felt something unfamiliar at my age. Not fear exactly, but exposure, as if I had stepped outside without a coat in the middle of an Ohio winter. When he answered, his voice carried the usual steadiness, polite and measured, and for a second I almost slipped back into old habits, asking about work, about the weather in Chicago, about practical things that required no vulnerability. But instead I took a slow breath and said the words I had rehearsed quietly in my kitchen. Daniel, I owe you an apology, and there was a pause on the other end, not hostile, just surprised. I told him that over the years I had confused guidance with control, that I had offered correction when I should have offered support, and that I was beginning to understand how that must have felt from his side. And I did not follow those sentences with an explanation or a defense. I simply let them stand on their own. For most of my life I believed that if I admitted fault I would lose authority. But in that moment, I realized authority was never the goal. Connection was, and connection requires honesty more than dominance. Daniel did not respond immediately, and in that silence I resisted the urge to fill the space with justification, because growth sometimes means allowing discomfort to exist without rushing to escape it. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, not dramatic, not emotional, just open, and he said he appreciated hearing that from me, that he had not expected it, and that he had always wanted us to understand each other better. Nothing miraculous happened during that call. There was no sudden transformation, no emotional speeches, just a simple agreement to talk more, to visit soon, to try again without the old tension. And yet when I ended the call and set the phone down on the desk, the house felt different, not because the walls had changed, but because I had. I stepped back onto the porch as the evening sun stretched across the fields, the air cool against my face, and I understood something that had taken me 8 decades to grasp. Change is not a dramatic reinvention. It is a quiet decision repeated consistently. It is choosing humility over pride in a single conversation, choosing listening over lecturing at one dinner table, choosing accountability over excuses in one honest moment. I do not know how many years I have left, but I know this. It is never the calendar that determines whether your life shifts direction. It is your willingness to confront the lessons you once ignored and respond differently the next time they appear. And as I sat there watching the light fade over the farmland that has witnessed my entire adulthood, I felt a calm certainty settle in, not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time I was no longer waiting for circumstances to change before I did. In this powerful reflective story set in rural Ohio, an elderly father with a long white beard confronts the uncomfortable truth that real change does not come from time alone, but from finally accepting a true life lesson. After a simple question from his grandson, the grandfather begins to examine decades of pride, missed conversations, and emotional distance that shaped his relationship with his son, realizing that each ignored life lesson quietly widened the space between them. Through honest self-reflection, the elderly father understands that providing financially was never enough, and that the most important life lesson he failed to embrace was humility in everyday moments. As he looks back on missed races, dismissed concerns, and conversations filled with correction instead of curiosity, he sees how every repeated pattern carried a hidden life lesson he chose not to face. Ultimately, when the grandfather makes a vulnerable phone call to his son and offers an apology, without excuses, he demonstrates that the final and most transformative life lesson is taking responsibility before time runs out, proving that growth is not about dramatic reinvention, but about choosing humility, accountability, and emotional courage in the moments that matter most.